Good evening, everyone. It's Joe Abadi for Vintage Motocross Q&A. In the studio with me tonight is nine-time national champion Scott Summer. We'll be back with all of our questions for Scott. Everyone, I'm Joe Abadi. You are watching Vintage Motocross Q&A, and in just a moment, we'll have my friend Scott Summer back in the studio with us, and we'll have a good time asking him some questions about his amazing career. Right now, I want to thank our sponsors, Motion Pro, Vmxq, Full Circle Racing, ReplicaMotorcycleParts.com, the International Motocross Museum, Racer X, and Preston Petty Products. My guest tonight is a nine-time national off-road champion in GNC and hare scrambles. He is native of Kentucky. He has amassed over 69 overall wins in competition. He's also competed in the international six-day trials where he has won 3 gold medals. He even rode in the Baja 1000. I'm looking forward to asking him about that. And of course, in 2014, he was inducted into the AMA Hall of Fame. It's my pleasure to have as my guest tonight, Mr. Scott Summer. Scott, thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you, Joe. Glad to be here.
Boy, 9-time national champion, the Baja. You know what, Scott? Here's what I want to do. A lot of my viewers understand motocross and enduro, certain things like that, but we have a lot of viewers out in Long Island, New York, who may not be familiar with what GNCC, Grand National Cross Country, and hare scrambles are. What are the difference between those two types of events?
Well, primarily the difference is who the promoters were.
Okay.
And the National Hare Scrambles was promoted by the AMA. So they allowed different clubs across the country, from coast to coast, the opportunity to put on events. And then the GNCC series started out to be the 100-miler series. And that was the Coombs family, what is now Racer Productions. They started their own series. And the differences were a little bit geographical. Like all the Coombs races were east of the Mississippi River.
Okay.
And the National Hare Scrambles were nationwide. And the National Hare Scrambles, I think they used to take like your best 7 out of 9 races. And the GNCCs, maybe your best 8 out of 12 back in the day. So both series allowed throwaways. And the races were just different. You know, the AMA series, because a different club would put on every race, there were some inconsistencies, you know, like you kind of had to anticipate the starting procedure to be a little bit different each time.
Okay.
Which was a little bit harder to adjust to. Whereas the Coombses kind of really had their act together because they did every event themselves. And they learned a lot and they got good at it. So from a racer's perspective, you know, slowly the Coombs series became better in lots of ways if you were a racer.
Uh-huh.
But early on, the National Hare Scramble series was more probably would get better audience. It was more respected to be the National Hare Scrambles champion.
Right.
Than it was to be the 100-miler champion early on, but that all changed.
Tell me this, Scott. How many guys start off in that race? And I know a GNCC was about 3 hours long. How many guys start off in that race, and do you all start at the same time?
Well, your class would start at the same time. So you may have 30, 40 guys in your class. And it was differentiated by row. So maybe every class would leave 1 minute apart. The pros would start in the front, and then maybe, well, it used to be just the open A class and the 250A class. And they would alternate week to week. because there was some really fast guys in each one of those classes that was capable of winning overall. And of course, it was an advantage to start in the first row, especially in a dusty race.
Oh yeah.
So then it was time adjusted at the end of the day. Um, and so they try to even the playing field, even though everybody wasn't starting at the same time. Of course, that would have been just a melee in the first turn,
Yeah.
had 400
Yeah.
guys taking off at once.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the Coombs family, I want to take a moment to thank RacerX for being a sponsor of our show. RacerX, the finest motocross publication on your newsstand and online. So the length of the ride too, Scott, you explained how many guys might be in the race, how they take off. Is it one long loop, or is it? Do you repeat that loop? How long is it?
Yeah, typically, between 8 and 12 miles long. Sometimes they were longer. Blackwater, which was the Coombs's first really big deal, was
Yes.
four 25-mile loops. So it was unusual to get access to a piece of property where you could make the loop that long. Blackwater was kind of special in that the place was so big. Yeah, that's kind of what drew me to this type of racing, was the adventure aspect of it. You get to see some beautiful places and be out in nature with a huge group of guys that are all kind of thrill seekers, like
Yeah.
I. From a notoriety standpoint, the National Hare Scrambles used to be the thing. If you were the National Hare Scrambles champ, you had really done something. Back in the days of like Eddie Lojack and Kevin Hines and Mark Hyde, the guys that came before me, my heroes. Um, I grew up reading cycle news articles and going to National Hare Scrambles races, seeing guys like Jack Penton just do things that I thought were amazing.
Right. And you had Dick Burleson back then, of course, Malcolm Smith.
That's right. That's right. Malcolm Smith was the inspiration for my parents, getting interested in motorcycling, just like so many other people, because of On Any Sunday.
Yeah.
In Louisville, there was a motorcycle club called the Woodsman, and they put on races. And that was how I became exposed. I was like a third generation motorcycle guy, and grew up going to motocross races when I was just a really little kid. And over the years, learned about that they even had a national hare scrambles. I only knew about local motocrosses and local hare scrambles, and kind of things went one thing led to another, and
Right.
we were hip deep into it.
So you know what, Scott? Let's talk about that for a second. Every young rider has somebody who probably inspires him, or maybe someone they saw riding a motorcycle, or a neighbor, a cousin, a friend. Who was the inspiration for you very, very early on? And when did you see that? Or maybe there wasn't. Maybe it was just your thing.
Well, it was my dad. My dad was my hero, and he was a really fast local motocross guy.
Mm-hmm.
And, I grew up, going to watch him race and watch him work on his bike in the garage, and pull tools out of the toolbox. And to me, it was just so exciting. And my dad was one of the stars of the show every weekend when I would go and get to witness it as a little kid, riding my bicycle around and dreaming about, doing the stuff.
Yeah. Now, and this was in Kentucky. This was in Kentucky.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I had a thought right before we started the show tonight that you were from Kentucky, and it's not a very big state, but there was also a very popular racer down there. His name was Nicky Hayden. Did you know Nicky?
Yeah, I met Nicky at some Honda functions years ago. Yeah, super nice guy, really cool family.
Yeah. With the races being the length that they are, sometimes up to 3 hours and a real long distance, your training regimen must have been something special. How did you train for these events? What was that like? Walk us through your week of or your season of training for these events.
Well, in the early years, my training pretty much consisted of just riding my bike.
Yeah.
As the season went on, I would kind of ride myself into better shape, and probably was more competitive toward the end of the season than I was at the first couple rounds. Um, as we started taking this thing more and more seriously, my dad and I got in these conversations about performance.
Hmm.
And we used to have these long conversations on the drives home from places like Davis, West Virginia, back to Kentucky. And we would really get into this thing like trying to study what our limiting factors had been, you know? Like even if you win a race, there's reasons why you could have won by more, you know, because nobody's
Yeah.
perfect. And one of the things that we always kind of came back to was my biggest limiting factor. I felt like was that I got tired, and and I was like, well, that's something that I can do something about. You know, I can get in better shape. So uh, I was maybe one of the first guys to really take that part of it seriously, where I started wearing a heart rate monitor and really working on my heart.
Hmm.
Realizing that my heart was probably the most important muscle in my body. Yeah, you want strong quads and you want strong triceps, and but you really want your brain to be oxygenated with rich blood, so
Yeah.
that you can even think and make good decisions on that third lap of or 12th lap of a 3 hour race, whatever it was.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah. So your mom and dad were behind you in this early on. I understand your first bike was was in 1982 an XR 200.
Well, I had bikes before that. I had little
Before
mini
that,
bikes.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I had little
Yeah.
mini bikes, and I started riding when I was 5. I started racing when I was 7. Um, my first race was at Castle Point here in Kentucky, where they held a national years ago. I got my picture taken with Steve Stackable, I think.
Yeah.
There's a picture of me and maybe him holding his trophy or something. But yeah, the XR200 was a bike that my mom and dad got me for Christmas in 1982. And like I said, I had ridden several years before that, but I was never good at riding the motorcycle. But when I got that XR200, it was very predictable and very user friendly, and it allowed me to learn uh, things that I was not able to learn on the smaller two strokes. And I don't know if it's because I was never a master of the clutch, but to me, the two strokes were always too much power or not enough power. And
Ah,
I was always in this zone of inefficiency, you know, where I'm not going as fast as I want to go, or I'm going faster than I want to go. And I have wheelies and wheel spin and these things I can't control. So, anyway, when I got that XR200, it was like the bike was doing all these things for me that I wasn't able to do for myself before. And it was like magic, it was like um, I learned how to carry more speed through the corners because the
right.
bike didn't have a lot of power to accelerate once you're done with cornering, Um,
Yeah.
it's funny. I talked to Rodney Smith about this years and years later, and he said he had an XR200 too, and he felt the same way that I did. That bike was really good for teaching you the fundamentals, and being such a fun little bike that's easy to control. And I thought, well, isn't that fascinating? Rodney and
Yeah.
I have completely different backgrounds, but we wind up at the highest level,
Yeah,
competing.
it's funny that you should bring up Rodney Smith. I wanted to know, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. I've had Rodney on the show. Rodney's been to my house. He's a great guy. And when I started to look at the statistics, I see that you guys were competing at the same time. And I just wanted to. We'll talk about Rodney a little bit more a little bit later on in the show. Right now, I want to thank our sponsor, Tom McAllister and Full Circle Racing. You got a special still going on: 18, 19, and 21-inch rims. He will lace them and true them for you, give you spokes, new nipples, and you could send your hubs up there. He'll bead blast them and powder coat them, send you a brand new set of rims back for just $775. Tom McAllister and Full Circle Racing. My guest tonight is Rodney Smith. I mean, my guest tonight is Scott Summer. We were talking about Rodney Smith. Scott, you said that you were racing at 7 years old, and you went on from there. I haven't had a chance to ask anybody this in quite some time, because I haven't had a racer on the show or a guest that began racing at such an early age. What were your responsibilities around your house with your parents as a kid growing up? Did you have a job? How did it go in school? Or were you just so preoccupied with motorcycles, none of that mattered? What was early life like?
Well, I was very blessed to happen to grow up in a family that were hardworking people, that had kind of the extra income to be able to go do this thing that's pretty expensive. And I was lucky in that my dad was kind of an entrepreneur, where he worked for some other companies when I was really young. But as I got into my teens, he started his own company, and I had the opportunity to work for him. And that gave me a lot of freedom that I don't think I would have had. It gave me good income that I don't think I would have had otherwise.
What did he do? What did he do, Scott?
Well, my dad was a chemist, but he was also an inventor, and he was involved in several different industries. But one of the companies he worked for made like vibratory screening equipment, and he was a sales rep for them. And then initially he ended up doing like contract processing, where companies would send him materials to be processed, let's say to a certain particle size,
Right.
screened, filtered, whatever, and then sent back to them. So my dad was kind of like a mad scientist. He had this workshop, and all these things, these conveyor pumps and filters and things would be running at all times. And he was the brains of the operation, and I was kind of the brawn. He would figure out the process,
Right.
and then I was kind of the monkey that would that would make the process happen, and then he'd do the invoicing and take care of all that. But that gave me a freedom, that I didn't have a 9-to-5 job.
Right.
I could take care of business with my dad, and boy, if it was a pretty day, he let me go run my bike.
Somebody actually asked me. I think your dad's name was Wade. Is he still with us, Scott?
He is still with us. Yep, I'm still fortunate to have him. He's slowing down. Things are. He's a fraction of the man he used to be, because medical things are trying to take over his body.
Yeah.
And it's hard to see him not thriving the way he once did. But I'm lucky to still have him.
When you first started riding there, when you said you started riding at 7 years old, were those scrambles? Those weren't motocross. Maybe it was motocross back then. I don't know. Or was it scrambles, or what was it like when you first began?
Well, my first race was a motocross, and I'll tell you
Okay.
how scared and intimidated I was by being on that starting line. I used to wait until everybody was into the first corner before I would leave the gate. I was just that conservative and afraid. And of course,
Yeah.
as the years went by, I got a little more aggressive. But yeah, my first races were always motocrosses, and then some local hair scrambles happened, and I went, and there might not have even been a youth class. I remember racing with all the big guys, and gosh, right off the bat, I just fell in love with that style of racing. Like I said before, the adventure aspect of it,
Yeah.
and the duration of it. Local races were 2 hours long, but then just the terrain, the steep hills and the rocks and the roots and the trees, and then the other riders. The other riders were also an obstacle. And I remember in my first race passing a lot of adults, and I thought, man, how cool is this? I must be better at this than I was at motocross.
Yeah.
So that kind of lit my fire. And then, boy, I just couldn't get to enough hair scrambles races, from that point forward.
Wow. Hey, listen, Scott, I got to take a little bit of a break, and we will be right back with more Scott Summer. To visit the International Motocross Museum on Facebook, Instagram, and of course their website, internationalmotocrossmuseum.org. This is a 501c3 not-for-profit organization. You go over there and buy some shirts, hats, all sorts of swag, and there's going to be a big announcement about the International Motocross Museum coming up in the next couple of weeks on our show. Right now, my guest is Scott Summer. Scott, I was listening to it was a video about when you were inducted into the AMA Hall of Fame. I think that happened in 2014. But in that video, Bevo 40 said that he knew you as a racer. He saw you out on the GNC and hare scramble circuit, and one day he happened to be in Ohio, and you're working at the Cincinnati airport.
Yeah, I used to work as a baggage handler for Piedmont Airlines, and they went on to become U.S. Airlines. The airport was only about maybe 15 miles away from my house.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom worked for Delta Airlines, so I think she knew somebody and helped me get on at Piedmont. But that was a cool job because it gave me flight privileges back then, but budgeting, trying to figure out my racing habit was difficult. So being able to fly free was really cool. And then just having a physical job, I would get up in the belly of those airplanes and I'd handle the freight and the mail and the luggage. Just burning a lot of calories, those flights have to leave on time, and there's a fair bit of physical work that has to happen, to pull that off. I would get up early in the morning and ride my bicycle to work, to get some extra training in. It's kind of funny that Bevo even saw me because I was pretty much behind the scenes, at my job.
Yeah.
But I did that to supplement, the income that I made from working for my dad back in the early days of when my racing was getting started.
Okay. It was an interesting choice, the Honda XR200, and then of course you went on to the bigger XR model, the 650, I think it was, or 600.
600, yeah.
It was a 600. Anyway, this is now 20 years. Today, the four-stroke is all the rage. It happened around the turn of around 2000. Doug Henry on the Yamaha. But you made that your weapon of choice way back before it was in vogue by any means. And there were plenty of guys out there who were on lighter two-stroke bikes. What was it that you did? You talked earlier about why you liked the bike, the tractability and how it didn't wear you down so much. But there had to be a special setup for that bike along the way, suspension-wise, gearing, and other things. Can you walk us through that and how your bike was specially prepared for what you did?
Yeah, I just fell in love with that 200 because of the user friendliness of it. So I started racing the XR200 at local hare scrambles and motocross. And, I did fairly well locally. I think I remember winning overall at hare scrambles events on that 200. But eventually
Okay.
I ran up against riders that were really good. And I was getting beat because I decided I needed more power. And I went from an XR200 to a CR500. And that's just about as far away an extreme thing as I could have done. Of course, I went too far. The 500 had so much power that I could lug it, but it was just too much. And then we got a CR250 And then in 1985, the XR600 came out, and my grandfather, my dad's dad, got me one of those for a graduation gift.
What bike is this here? And what bike is this here in this picture, Scott? Is this the 400?
That's the XR600.
The 600.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the first time I rode the 600, I was like, man, this bike is like it was made for me, because it was so similar to the 200, but it had all the power that I could ever need. So I think that thing had about 42 horsepower. Doesn't seem like a huge amount, right? Today, but it had enough power to compete with the conventional bikes of the day, which was the 250 two-strokes. And the thing about the 600 that I didn't even realize so much at the time was that the torque that bike had was magnificent.
Yeah.
Farmers that drive tractors, they know about torque, and
Yeah.
and there's a real efficiency to torque. And what I mean by that is that it was almost like having an automatic. You know, I could ride the bike in such a low gear and stay in that gear for so long because of the torque. And then it was almost as if that bike had traction control. Not like we have traction control today, but it was like a traction control that was built in with the design of that motor. There was so much inertia inside that motor. The torque was just incredible. And even today, I'm not so sure that all the different motorcycle manufacturers are aware of the magic of the XR600. There was some things really special about that bike that I'm not sure even today people truly appreciate. I mean, yeah, my bike was heavier than other bikes, but the weight was really down low. And that bike would go through rocks, almost like cheating. You know, we have this rocky creek bed on our property in Petersburg where the rocks are real jagged and they're all angled in different directions.
Yeah.
And on any motorcycle, I think on the planet, when you get up to about third gear and you get in those rocks and they're all trying to influence your direction, they get deflected. And you're kind of like a ping pong ball. You start bouncing, every which way.
Yeah.
Things get dangerous. You have to back off the throttle. Well, on an XR600, you get to about third gear and you start thinking about fourth because it's just so confidence inspiring. And I think, at the time I didn't realize it, but I think that frame on that bike was so small. It was round tubing. And I think that frame was flexing so much that the wheels were actually going left to right from side to side. And the frame was allowing that. Of course, in Florida, when we would get in some deep sand whoops, the bike would start swapping and it'd be a problem. I'd have to back off the throttle. But in rocks, that was a magical combination between that rubbery frame of the bike and that huge amount of torque. It really gave me an advantage. And when I started looking back at my career, almost all the tracks that were rocky, I could win those races, but if there were tracks like didn't have one rock on them, I never won a race there. Just because, my bike didn't have an opportunity to do what it did best. And but me now,
Yeah. Yeah. Scott, is a very famous picture. It's one of those things that once you see it, you can't forget it. I remember seeing it. I was wondering if it were actually even true, but you're a pretty big guy. Scott, how big are you? What are you, like 6'4"?
No, I'm 6'1", and I weigh about 175 pounds.
But in this picture, you probably weighed a little bit more, and you were probably in incredible condition too.
Yeah, I was probably 185, 195 when I was at my peak.
What did this bike weigh in this picture, and who told you to pick the bike up, or how did that happen?
Well, those bikes weigh 300 pounds, and that all started because I was cleaning the shop one day, and I needed to move a motorcycle out of the middle of the floor so I could mop the floor. And there was a bike sitting there that didn't have forks or shock, didn't have the wheels on it.
Right.
And I picked it up and carried it in the corner of the room. Well, Fred or one of my buddies saw that and thought it was cool and said, "Hey, do you think you can pick it up with the rest of the parts on it?" And I said, "Well, I think I can, because that wasn't all that hard, you know." So I did it, and they thought it was neat, and they took a picture of it. And next thing you know, Tim Tollison from Dirt Bike Magazine wanted a picture of it, and he ended up running that on the cover of the magazine.
Yeah.
And next thing you know, that really got this marketing thing going, where I became the guy more well known for picking up his bike than
For
for,
racing it.
you know.
Yeah.
But that was
Yeah.
beautiful for my sponsors, because they got all this additional exposure from what was kind of a gimmick.
Yeah. Yeah.
and, and then
Hey, Scott.
go ahead.
Yep, I got to give a plug here to replicamotorcycleparts.com. Paul Parkinson Sr. If you have a part and you need it reproduced, Paul will absolutely make it for you. He's doing a lot with airboxes and all sorts of things that go on your Hondas, Yamahas, and Suzukis. In the new year, I understand he's going to be making gears and even some rare aftermarket cylinder heads. That's replicamotorcycleparts.com. You mentioned your mechanic friend, Fred Bramblett.
Right.
I guess he had a lot to do with setting up that bike, but I've got a couple of things going on here. You described him as not only your mechanic, but as your publicist and as your agent. I mean, I've never heard a racer say they had a publicist, an agent, and a mechanic, let alone all those things wrapped up in one guy. Tell us about your relationship with Fred, how you guys met, and the rest of the dynamics of that relationship.
Well, Fred and his brother were pretty good motocrossers in the Louisville area. And my dad and our family were kind of friends with his family going back to when I was a little kid. And I have to thank my dad for bringing Fred into my racing program, because I think my dad recognized that Fred was a smart guy. And he and his brother eventually owned a dealership locally.
Mm-hmm.
He had some business acumen, and he also was a really motorcycle enthusiast. So I think my dad recognized that Fred possessed a lot of the things that I needed going forward. As my dad started to step back away from my racing program, Fred kind of stepped in to that role. And Fred was almost kind of overqualified to just be a mechanic, because he was capable of so much more. He had a vision for what I could do. He was involved with the Coombs. You know, he and Big Dave and Rita had conversations about the future of the sport. And I think Fred understood marketing and what could be of my future and the future of the way Racer Productions did their thing. So I was just lucky that I was in the middle of the mix. And Fred made me aware of some things that we could do to make me a better asset to my sponsors. You know, he explained to me that the reason companies are willing to pay racers is not necessarily to win races. It's to sell products.
Yeah.
Of course, winning races helps sell products. But Fred had me doing things like he put together a media kit, and we would go to, let's say, Pittsburgh on a Friday night before there was going to be a race in the area, and give them some B-roll footage, and have me show up at the studio, and the local newscaster could interview me and talk about this upcoming race, and let the general community know what a hair scrambles even was, and hey, we're getting to have one. And I think the Coombses appreciated that, because it maybe drove some traffic, you know, to force for them to have more spectators. And I know that Honda and Pirelli and Arai and Alpenstars and all my sponsors appreciated that too, because it gave them another chance for me to kind of pimp their products in a different venue. So ultimately, I think that those media kits and that additional exposure
Yeah.
probably really helped us in lots of ways, but probably helped us land my first big contract with Honda.
Now, Scott, now that you bring that up, weren't you like one of the first off-road guys? I mean, Honda, of course, had their road racers, they had their motocrossers, but they didn't have too many cross-country hare scrambles guys that they really took under their wing and gave a contract. Weren't you one of the first?
Yeah, I think, and I wasn't an in-house Honda guy. Fred and I ran Summers Racing, which was our own program, and we had Honda support. So we got to make all the decisions, as far as what races we went to
Yeah.
and what tires went on the bike and who my goggle sponsor was and on and on and on, who our suspension company was. So, at the time, I thought I wanted that full on factory support
Right.
because I wanted attention from that big, huge company that had access to all those brilliant minds, right? But now looking back, I think, well, I had it pretty good, because I had all this freedom that
Yeah.
I wouldn't have had I been an in-house Honda guy. And I was so passionate about it. I was so eager to get to the next level performance wise, that I don't think it held me back. The fact that we were an independent team sponsored by Honda versus had I been an in-house, Honda guy. I think there were probably some things that we could have benefited from um, doing it the other way. I probably would have had more titanium parts right from Japan.
Yeah, but Scott, look how successful your career was. 69 wins, 9 championships. I'm not so sure if a titanium axle is gonna turn that to 70 wins. I get it. I've spoken to many guys about their factory bikes and having that support behind them, but I just can't imagine that how can I say it? They're not going to build a better mousetrap. I don't think, as far as your career goes.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right, Joe. I mean, looking back, I just feel like I was so blessed.
Yeah.
So many people came into my life at the right time. The guy named Bill Reichlich at White Brothers um, that worked on my White Power forks, and man, he made them really good. Um, there was a guy named Gary Gramer that was a local machinist. Uh, there was a guy named Rick Nowak that was a local welder. And, I could go to my friends and say, hey, I got this problem. Can you help me out? And man, those guys were just jumping in to be a part of my program. It's so unselfish of them, because I couldn't pay them much.
Right.
They wanted to be a part of it because we were trying to make a difference, trying to become champions and and fly the flag of Northern Kentucky boys, throwing dirt.
Hey, Scott, one of the most memorable races I ever had in vintage motocross, and it just came to me while we were talking, was at a place called Crofton, Kentucky. Are you near there?
No, I'm in the northern part of the state. I'm up near Cincinnati.
Okay. No,
Yeah.
this was in the southern part of the state, Crofton. It was just a great track. I had a fabulous day there, one day in my vintage motocross career, and I just wanted to know if you were there. Now, 69 overall wins, Grand National cross country, hare scrambles. What were some of the? Can you recall a really difficult race? I mean, I'm sure they're all difficult, but can you recall one where it was like, I don't know if I'm going to make it through this. I can't believe the conditions are that bad.
Well, a 3-hour race is a long race.
Yeah.
And riding a dirt bike is not an easy thing to do. So the terrain, the state the race was in would kind of dictate how difficult it was going to be. And of all the races I've gone to, there was a race in Florida down near Cocoa Beach, and I think it was
Yeah.
around 1987. And at that time, I was in the 4-stroke class, and the whoops down there get deep. and the whoops are almost like the size of a Volkswagen car, you
Yeah.
know, and you just keep hitting these things, and they're relentless and they don't stop, and it's almost like masochistic, you know. It's like everybody is playing this game, and we're all enduring pain, and at the end of the day, it's almost like a tough man competition,
Yeah.
uh, almost like if you lined up 300 or 400 guys and said, "All right, we're going to do push-ups for 3 hours, and let's just see who the toughest guy is today. Start now." Of course, that's probably never been done, but it kind of puts it in perspective. You know, it's like uh, that guy that did 7,000 push-ups, he's pushing that guy right next to him to do
Yeah.
7,001, right? So you get into this thing, it's like driven by testosterone and adrenaline and competition, and it forces you to do things that you would not do if it was just you doing it alone, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, this race in Florida, there was a guy named Jojo Keller and
Yeah,
another
I know JoJo, Northeast guy. Yeah.
yeah, and another guy named Steve Martin, and they were going so fast through these whoops that day. They were just hitting the tops of these things.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking about these guys like these are superhuman beings. You know, how in the world are they going that fast over this difficult of a terrain, and doing it for this duration of time? And they lapped me that day at that race. And I think I had a rare mechanical failure where my bike DNF'd, and I had to walk out of the woods. And I was suffering physically so bad that I was actually glad that my bike broke because I didn't want to do it anymore.
Yeah.
and, and I think about that sometimes, like what an interesting, fascinating sport this is, where everybody is willing to put themselves through this grueling amount of pain. You
Yeah.
know, like there's pain when you're training, if you're lifting weights or you're jumping rope or you're jogging or sprinting. There's pain that you have to endure to get to that level that JoJo and Steve Martin were in that day. And then there's pain that you endure during the race. And then we learn these little tricks, right? Like, what can we do to our bikes so that we don't have to endure so much pain?
Yeah.
It reminds me of a function I went to with Parts Unlimited one time. And we were with the owner of the company, and he had all the top athletes of the day come to meet and greet dealers. Uh, Ben Bostrom was there, Travis Pastrana was there,
Yeah.
uh, myself, Jeremy McGrath, and on and on and on. You know, the elite premier guys of the different disciplines. And me and the racers were having this conversation. And I don't know why I got this idea, but I was telling them about how my trainer used to have me lean up against the wall with my knees bent, sitting like a chair,
Yeah.
but there's no chair there.
Yeah.
You're just leaning against the wall. Well, eventually your
Right.
quadriceps start to really burn, and it gets really hard to stay in that position. Well, next thing I know, Travis Pastrana and Ben Bostrom are doing this against each other up against the wall. And they do it for so long that it's incredible. Like, they refuse to lose. Um, and
Yeah.
it was such an interesting exercise about the will of the competitive mind of a racer. You know, it's like you want you hate to lose so bad that you're willing to put yourself through some really grueling conditions, um,
Yeah.
because you
I
hate to lose.
actually saw you had a quote, Scott, and I don't want to get it wrong, so maybe you could correct me if I don't have it quite right. But you said that the desire to win far surpassed the pain you had to go through to get there, or something very similar to that. Do
Yeah,
you remember
yeah,
saying that?
yeah. Like um, uh, you have to hate to lose really bad,
That's it.
and
Yeah,
uh, and I think a lot of racers get this, and it's kind of weird if you really think about it,
it
because
is.
who wants to suffer that much? But that's what it all comes.
Tell me this, Scott. We were talking about guys doing push-ups and pushing ourselves to limits, and one guy really, so to speak, they say like iron sharpens iron, one man sharpens another. You raced the 1990s Grand National Cross Country Hare Scrambles. You, Rodney Smith, and Scott Plessinger pretty much dominated those years. Were you friendly with those guys? How much did you push each other in that series throughout those years?
Well, Joe, it was really weird. We were friendly with each other, but at the same time, we all wanted the same thing so bad. I'm a little bit of ashamed of how I dealt with some things. Like I would learn things that I didn't want my competitors to know, because I didn't want to help take food off my plate come Sunday. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And that I'm kind of ashamed of. I'm sad that there was a level of selfishness and greed and ego, like looking back on it, I wish I would have shared everything that I knew with all those guys all the time, and been happy for them if they beat me, yeah. But because of my ego and my greed, right? I want to win every race. I want the recognition of winning every race. And I was almost kind of angry when those guys would even show up on the starting line. Like, how dare you show up and try to take this bonus money from me?
But but Scott, that's the mindset of a winner. I mean, that sounds like Bob Hanna. That sounds like Kenny Roberts. That sounds like Roger. That sounds like Roger DeCoster. I mean, they all had that frame of mind.
Well, you're right. You're right. But at the end of the day, how cool would it have been if you would have shared everything you knew with all those guys and you still beat them, right? That would be cool.
Yeah.
But it's funny that you mentioned Rodney and Bob Hanna. When I was a kid, Bob Hanna was one of my big heroes. Mm-hmm. And there was an ISDE training school that Bob put on for us one year. And Bob had us going through these corners, and then he would watch us and then talk to us about our style going through that corner. Mm-hmm. And I was really determined to make a good impression on Bob because he was Bob, right? Yeah. And I go into this corner, and I brake later than I've ever braked before. And I hit this berm so hard that it just blasted it to smithereens. And I exited the corner. Somehow I'm still in control of the bike. But I hit this thing with everything I've ever had. And Bob looked at me, and he looked at the other guys that were all watching what I just did. And he kind of laughed, and he said, "Scott, I don't know what to say to you." He said, "You just did everything textbook wrong." He said, your elbows were in, your butt was way back over the rear fender. He said, your line selection was really odd, but he said, I wouldn't have wanted to race you through that corner. Yeah. So to me, that was one of the coolest moments of my life, because even though I did something unorthodox and it was kind of my way, right? I impressed Bob Hanna, and that felt good.
I bet it did. And you know what? Another guy who had kind of an unorthodox style, Bob Hanna actually said he looked like a sack of potatoes on the bike, was Tony DeStefano. Meanwhile, Tony DeStefano, 3-time national champion, an absolutely fantastic rider. So not everybody has that style, so to speak, that looks smooth and works. But we'll get back to that in just a moment. My guest is Scott Summer. We're going to take a short break here, Scott. We'll be right back.
Vmxq&A, who already has a full line of vintage parts, now has air shocks. that are an exact duplicate of the original air shocks so popular in the late 70s. So whether you're looking to build a full racer or museum showpiece, these shocks will give you that incredible 70s look and improve your bike's performance. These new air shocks are fully rebuildable with Vmxq rebuild kits, and all shocks are hand assembled in the USA with all new components. Every component is brand new. Just like the originals, our air shocks are adjustable with 2 chambers, high and low pressure, giving you tremendous flexibility for settings of your bike suspension. The Vmxq air shocks come fully assembled and ready for installation. Just add air or nitrogen. The kits include the manual and spacers. Visit Vmxq.com to check out the air shocks and all that Vmxq has to offer to help you get back on track and to keep that ride going.
Special from Vmxq is for your Suzuki RM100 125s, RV125s, TM100s. It is a rod kit, $139.95. It comes with everything you see here in the picture, including the wrist pin, the big end bearing, the thrust washers, everything you'll need to make that bike run so perfectly. Again, Vmxq, keep the ride going. My guest this evening is Scott Summer. We're talking about a lot of different things, including him impressing Bob Hanna with his unorthodox style on a motocross track. Scott, we had you mentioned that there were 9 national championships between GNCC and hare scrambles, but you went on to race another grueling and most punishing event, the International 6-Day Trials, and you took 3 gold medals in that as well. Where did you ride those races? What team were you part of? Was that on a Honda also?
Yeah, I rode my XR600 in all those 6 days events. I went to West Germany and Finland and Italy, Australia, and then I rode the one that we had in the States in Tulsa in '94. So I think I did about 5, maybe ISDEs altogether. One of the things that was interesting to me about the 6 days was it was all about your sprinting speed. So I didn't necessarily have that. Where I was competitive was in the long duration events, like a 3-hour hare scrambles, where maybe in the first hour I wasn't competitive. In the second hour, I would be more competitive. And in the third hour is where I'd really start to come into my own with just the physical element of that style of race. But the 6 days, I mean, yeah, we'd be on the bike for maybe 7 hours a day, covering lots of terrain, but there would only be these short special tests each day. And in these special tests, they may only be a couple miles long, but you had to sprint. And I really was pretty hopeless at those events. I mean, you can get a gold medal and still do kind of terrible, like a gold medal only means that I think you're within 10% of the winner of your class. So I never even got close to beating, to even winning my class at the 6 days, but I would do well enough to get a gold medal. And, I'm not really proud of any of my 6 days performances. All they did was showcase my lack of skill at being able to sprint on my dirt bike. But it was great because it was like a training camp, because we would get so many hours in and so many miles logged during that week of the 6 days. So I felt like I was a better rider at the end of that week, getting to be around these guys that were picking lines, that were really smart, and they would make these big, wide, arcing corners and carry all kinds of speed. And I would come in and kind of point and shoot. I'd look for a berm and try to square it off and brake slide and do these ridiculous things that made no sense when you have all the room in the world to choose a better line. Of course, I grew up racing in the woods where you didn't have all that freedom. There was 2 trees here and here, and you had to go right between them. So there was no line selection in that. But I learned a lot, and looking back, I felt like I would have been a much better rider if I would have gone to Europe and competed in that style of racing for maybe a year to get a better
Yeah.
understanding of corner speed and line selection. And those lines that they would choose would be so smart that they'd be shortening the track. Um, and I wasn't aware of that. I wasn't proactively using methods that I was aware of. I was always just kind of riding by the seat of my pants and doing what felt right. And basically, I was like
Yeah.
a fish out of water. I was a fish out of water every time I went to one of those events.
Who else was on your team at those races?
Well, there was some really good guys like Ty Davis and Ryan
Yeah.
Smith, Steve Hatch, Chris Smith. Um, yeah, there was some good guys, and guys like Rodney and Ty Davis, they were close to winning their class sometimes. Rodney almost won overall. I think his first year, maybe in '92. So Rodney did possess these skills that I did not have in that style of racing, and that really changed. That was good for Rodney, because when the GNCC series started to really grow, the courses had to get faster and more open, surely because of the volume of competitors, right? And when that happened,
Sure.
Rodney was the perfect guy to start winning lots of races and championships because he had that background, racing motocross in Europe and being good at carrying speed in corners, and having a right-hand man like Mark Hyde, who grew up kind of like I did in the eastern, rocks and roots of West Virginia and Ohio.
Yeah.
So it was fascinating, to see Rodney's career trajectory and success. Rodney was a better rider than I was in certain types of terrain. Absolutely. He could, to this day, teach me a lot.
Yeah.
But I beat Rodney in quite a few races when he first came up here from South America. But I did it because I had some years of experience that he didn't have yet. Ultimately, he got those years under his belt, and buddy, I couldn't stay with him anymore once he did.
Yeah. Scott, let me ask you this. You were loyal to Honda, and they were pretty good to you throughout all those years. Was there ever a time where you thought about jumping ship, where you offered a contract from any other manufacturer and decided to turn it down?
Well, I had some offers from KTM and ATK, and I think Kawasaki put something together for me at one point, and I did consider going with ATK at one point. It was I had gone from like national number 11 to number 9 to number 5 to number 3, and they were all odd numbers. And I was thinking, okay, I might just become the national champion. And that was when we were operating on a shoestring budget, and ATK kind of had a pretty good budget for marketing, and they put a bike together for me and had me come out there and ride their bike. And lucky for me that the bike broke that day. And it made me just realize, hey, man, the reason I've gotten where I am is because of the magic and the durability of these Honda XRs,
Yeah.
And I took a big gamble. At that time, Honda was offering me maybe a $2,500 parts credit and a couple of free bikes. And maybe ATK was offering maybe $60,000 or $70,000 and all the bikes I could ride. So to me, that was so hard. We needed the money, but I didn't want to end my string of success. I didn't want to jeopardize that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I gambled on the Honda, And it was the smartest thing I ever did, because that was the year that we went out and won both championships. And then everything changed. People all of a sudden found more budget, and we had some really good deals from that point forward. And boy, I think back, like, had I accepted that ATK deal, maybe I wouldn't ever have become the champion.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would have never won another race. And it's
And
pretty.
it all worked out, and you were in the right place, and you stayed in the right place at the right time. Motion Pro, they're still running a great special, 20% off everything across the board at Motion Pro except custom cable. So when you go to Motion Pro, get whatever you need, and when you check out, type in, there's a code, MP9135. That's MP9135. When you check out at Motion Pro, you save 20%. Scott Summer, tell me this. After that career was over, as far as racing goes, did you stay on with Honda? At what capacity were you still with them, and did you work with other guys who were riding Hondas at that time?
Well, I was involved with Honda on lots of other little projects, and ultimately Charlie Keller and Paul Slavic, two of the guys that I really respected in the company, came to me in kind of my twilight years of racing, and they offered me a job. They were like, "Hey, Scott, what would you like to do? We'd like to have you stay involved with us in some capacity." And at that time, I think it was going to involve moving to California, and I just couldn't. I couldn't even fathom leaving my home here in Kentucky. So I declined, and I'm not sure if that was a good decision or not. It was a great opportunity that they gave me, but at the time also, I wanted to stay involved in racing. So I thought, well, maybe I can keep a lot of these sponsorship relationships with my sponsors going, and hire some other riders. So that's exactly what I did.
I think that was around 2006. You put a team together with Honda to ride in the Suzuki GNCC series.
Right. Yeah. And we hired Paul Wibley.
Yeah.
And Paul rode with us. And I think we got one of Mike LaRocco's old two strokes for him to ride initially, and then we got some official bikes from California. And Paul did great. He had some good top 5 finishes, and he was a hard worker. And for whatever reason, we parted ways, and Paul went on to Randy Hawkins' program at Yamaha, and then he went on and became the GNCC champion. So he had a great career, and I'm happy that I was able to help him kind of climb that ladder of success. And then we ended up getting some support from BMW.
Yeah.
That came through, I guess, some conversations that Fred Bramblett had with some of those folks. And I hired Glenn Carney and Gordon Crockard.
Weren't they from Australia? One of the guys were from Australia?
Yeah. Gordon was from Ireland. And
Ireland?
Glenn was from Australia.
Yeah.
And of course, the BMW thing kind of fell apart. Like after we had signed the contracts with the riders and kind of got things organized.
Is that the bike there? Is that the bike there, Scott?
Yep, that's the bike. All of a sudden, they started having some supply issues and some mechanical issues, and the whole project kind of got put on hold. And we were like, "Hey, wait a minute. These guys have to go racing, and I've made promises to them already." So we were able to kind of force them to give us Husqvarnas because those were the only bikes that company had access to at that time. So basically, we went Husqvarna racing via BMW. That's kind of odd, but that's how that all worked out. And I had a contract to race myself in the Vet A class, so I was like the third rider, but just not at the premier level. So we did that, and the best finish that we got was Glenn got second overall one day, which was pretty good, pretty close to winning. I won almost all the races, I think, in my class that year, and I liked the Huskies, but I never really jived with the new generation four strokes.
Oh,
It's kind of funny that they were more powerful and they were lighter, um, but I never really jived with those bikes. Um, I finished second overall one day on the new CRF 450 X, um, but I never won. I never won on a new generation Honda four stroke, and I think a lot of that had to do with just my age. You know, I was in the
nope.
twilight years of productivity.
Yeah.
Um,
Was
but
was
also,
that you had some injuries too, Scott? You broke a femur, you broke a pelvis. Was that after your injuries?
yeah, that was after my injuries.
Yes.
In 1999, I won my last overall on an XR 600,
Hmm.
and I also broke my femur that year. And I never really felt like I came back 100% from that injury. Um,
Yeah.
uh, yeah, there was a couple of years there where I couldn't even dab, because it just hurt so bad to put my foot down. Um,
Yeah.
and I wondered if I would limp the rest of my life. Ultimately, it was an Amish man working in this really remote spot in Indiana uh, that solved my medical problem using methods that are
How did you do that?
very unconventional. Um, he uses iridology and kinesiology, and he looks into your eye and he can see things about your whole body by just looking into your eye. It's pretty fascinating. But anyway, he said, Scott, when you broke your leg, your femur is round, and it's not like it has a keyway where they knew exactly where it needed to line up to put it back
Right.
together. And he said they got it off just a little bit. And he said you got ligaments and tendons that are just not happy, and you got these knots in this muscle. And he said you need to get some deep tissue massage and get rid of these knots, and then your pain will go away. And lo and behold, he was right. As soon as I did that, I was great. And boy, it wasn't the conventional medical community that figured that out for me. It
Very
was,
interesting.
yeah, it was pretty cool.
Very interesting. Scott, in 2014, alongside Pierre Karsmakers and the late Tom White, you were inducted into the AMA Hall of Fame. What do you recall about that evening?
Well, I was just very flattered and very humbled. Um, I just felt so blessed. It's like I led like a dream life. Um,
Yeah.
so many of the perfect people and peers, and so many unselfish acts of kindness with regard to me and my pursuit of my career happened in order to get me where I was, and getting
Yeah.
to spend time with these industry leaders, getting to share that stage with those folks was definitely a highlight. My mom and dad were both there, and I shed some tears at that podium that night. It was pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, that's why I thought you were so much taller when I first saw this picture. I'm saying I've been with Tom White before, and you look a lot bigger than some of the guys that are in that picture. That's for sure. Scott, all of your career, I mean, of course, you've had some injuries, but with all the national championships you've won, all the accolades you've received, but it isn't always about all the glory and all the ceremonies and all the trophies. You had a major devastating setback in 2016. You lost your home
Yeah,
to a
that was.
fire, and here's a picture of it here. And I was wondering how, well, I don't have to ask you emotionally what that must have been like, but I wanted to know, was that the home you grew up in as a kid? Did you rebuild there? Were your trophies and memorabilia in that home?
Well, they were. we have another building on the property. It's like a pole barn, and
Is that it here, back here to the left?
no, it's kind of on the other side of the property.
Okay.
So I had some trophies in that building, but the ones that meant the most to me were in that house. So so I lost all that stuff. But you know what's cool about it? That seemed very devastating at the time.
Yeah.
And it was more devastating than probably the average person that loses their home, because I didn't have homeowners insurance.
Oh my gosh.
And I know that sounds crazy, but I've always been one of these people to take my own path. Just because everybody else does something doesn't mean that I'm going to do it. And I thought, well, I'll just self-insure. I got tired of spending whatever that money was every year. And I had a problem with my wood stove, and my insurance company was giving me some fits about it. And I thought, well, heck with you guys, I'll just self-insure. And then I lose my house, right? And at the time, it seemed terrible. But in the coming days, my brother-in-law had a brain injury, and he really needed my wife and I to move in with him to help him. And I thought, you know what? Isn't it beautiful how it's like God removed that house from our equation?
Yeah.
And he kept me from doing something that would have been immoral. Like, the right thing to do was to move in with my brother-in-law and help him. Had I still had that house,
yeah, you would have never done that.
I wouldn't have wanted to leave it, right?
Yeah.
So, and then something else has happened. So now we're seriously considering opening up a private riding area on that land for the Northern Kentucky, Greater Cincinnati area dirt bike people. And we wouldn't have wanted to have a house right in the middle of that property for a riding park, right? So now I have the benefit of hindsight, and I look back and I say, yeah, that was devastating at the time, but I'm one of these people that just believes everything happens for a reason.
Yeah.
And I feel blessed. It's like, yeah, it was a setback, and I look back at a lot of the things in my life. Like, yeah, maybe it was hardship because there was a lesson in that hardship, right? And maybe there was better stuff over the horizon. And it seems like, to me, the more I think about it, the more magical this world is. It's like, man, there's a lot more to this thing than I think we give credit for.
Yeah.
It reminds me of something that happened between me and Scott Plessinger and Rodney Smith. I think it was in 1995.
Yeah.
The championship was coming down between Scott and I. And he and I were kind of the best two guys back then. Either he would win or I would win. It was unusual that somebody else would win. And he had the points lead going into the last race. In order for me to win the championship, I had to beat Scott, and he had to finish worse than second. And I just started getting depressed. I was starting to get just sick to my stomach. Like, I don't even want to go to this race because I don't want to witness my own failure. I had just lost the GNCC championship to Scott the week prior.
Yeah.
And I'm just in a very sullen, dark place going into this final race. It was Seattle International Raceway. So my grandfather comes along, and he's like, Scott, what's wrong? I see that you're upset and you're unhappy. What's going on? So I told him this story. And he said, Scott, he said, there's power in words. He said, I want you to say, I'm going to win this race and I'm going to win this championship. And I thought, well, this sounds kind of corny. This is some of this religious hocus pocus stuff that he was into.
Yeah.
But because I wasn't fully buying into it at that time. But out of love for him, right, I said it. I said, all right, I'm going to win this race. I'm going to win this championship. But he could sense my tone of voice wasn't sincere. I was just
appeasing him by going through the motions. And he
Right.
said, no, Scott. He said, I want you to feel the meaning of your words. He said, I want you to say it and feel it in your heart. So I thought about it for a minute, and I took a deep breath, and I was like, okay, I'm going to go to this race. I'm going to win the race, and I'm going to win the championship. And the moment I said that, something happened inside of me. Like all the stress and all the worry just released from my body, right? And,
Yeah.
and it's like history changed. Like I was going to go and I was going to lose that race because I was so worried and I wasn't doing the things that I needed to do to prepare for that race just because of my attitude. And he's like, it says it in the Bible. There's power in words. I want you to speak those words. Well, I did it. And here's what happened at that race. Rodney Smith shows up, and it's a West Coast race. And Rodney's good at the fast open stuff. So he gets out front. He gets out front early. And he must have hit a stump or something and messed up his front brake. So I get around him, and I'm in second. And I get a pretty good lead. And Scott comes up behind me. So I'm in first. Scott's in second. Rodney's back pretty far because he had to spend some time working on his bike. And I have a great day. I'm just chugging away. I got my rhythm, and I'm getting through the obstacles. And some other stuff happened that was crazy. But at the end of the day, Rodney's coming back. And he's coming back strong. And eventually he passes Scott. He gets back into second. But then he decides he's going to try to beat me. He's going to reel me in. So he's riding a little bit reckless, right? So he crashes. And he has a pretty big get off. And he gets back up going again. Scott gets around him. Anyway, he gets back around Scott. And he finishes second that day. So Rodney won the championship for me that day. I won the race. Rodney got second, and Scott finished third. And I thought, man, that was all preordained. It's like that race was a blessing. And the bonus money that I got from winning that race probably paid for the property that we have right now. It was magical, and we don't realize that there's more to this stuff. And I'm so grateful for it. I'm just so grateful.
Scott, it's not too often I get somebody that comes on the show that proclaims their faith, their trust in the Lord, that had a member of their family sort of lead them to Christ at a certain moment. But I'm glad you opened up about that, and that we were able to have that moment. What is going on in this picture? Who's this lovely lady?
Well, that's another blessing. That's my beautiful wife, Amanda. And we got married on October the 10th, 2010. So we've been married for 13 years. And, in my life, I've been very selfish, right? Like I've been all about me. I've been about winning races and winning championships. And I've had a lot of friends come in and surround me and be unselfish and kind of get me to the places I wanted to go. And Amanda's totally different than me. She is all about other people. It's like that woman has taught me a lesson about how to be a better human being. The more I look at things now, I'm like, on our headstones when we die, we should probably have 2 columns of numbers. There should be a column of number of like selfish acts, and then another column of number, another number on this column that is unselfish acts, right? And whoever's numbers are higher in the unselfish category are really the better human beings. It's not about money or fame or fortune or success. It's about how we treat people. That's truly the measure of a man. And I'm sad to say that I was broken for the first half of my life. And my wife has taught me that I had it all wrong, you know, by showing me by example that she has it right. She just does for others, and that's all she's ever done. And I'm so proud of her, you know, and I want to be more like her for the second half of my life. So there's stuff I'm ashamed of because I was so selfish and self-centered. I feel like God put her in my life to teach me that lesson and to give me a wonderful role model on how I was wrong and how I better start getting it right.
Well, that's absolutely fabulous, Scott. And that's something you and I can probably have a conversation on for a good long time, because my wife, Susie, we were like that too. But at least you have 9 championships. I don't have any. So. Scott, we've covered a lot of ground here today. But as we've been speaking the last hour and 20 minutes already, is there something that maybe you would like to talk about that I didn't ask you a question about, or something that maybe you remembered as we were going on that you'd like to bring up right now?
Well, I just like to thank all those people, you know, that were the unsung heroes along my path.
Yeah.
That just helped me so much. You know, there was a guy named Mark Schmidt, that went to a lot of races and sacrificed his own time. There was a guy named Gary Jones, not the racer, but just a good friend here in Northern Kentucky. He's just always been in my corner, you know. And yeah, I got a lot of recognition and the bonus dollars and all these things. But I really want to thank all those people that were in my corner, and my wife. You know, she's been one of those people too, and all my competitors. You know, the guys I raced against, those guys are badasses. You know, Ty Davis and Guy Coop and Eddie Lojak, and Scott Plessinger. And Steve McSwain and Dwayne Connor and Kevin Brown. I mean, you don't win one of those races without being a very disciplined, hard-working animal of a person. You know, I'm amazed by what all those guys did, and just so proud to have been part of that group and led an exciting life.
My guest has been 9-time national champion Scott Scummer. Scott, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, and not only for opening up about your racing career and things that went on there, but really giving us an open look about who you are emotionally at times, as a husband, as a friend. It was something certainly different than interviews that I usually get. Thank you for being here and opening up so much to us.
My pleasure, Joe.
Do not disconnect your computer. Don't hang up, whether you're on your computer or your phone. I'm going to download the show, so we'll have it, and I'll call you in just a couple of minutes. But for now, we're going to say goodbye to Scott Scummer. Don't hang up, though, Scott, okay?
No problem.
Thanks, brother. My guest tonight has been Scott Scummer. We are going to take a little commercial break here, our last one, and we'll be back to wrap it up. Hey, it's Joe Abadi for Vintage Motocross Q&A. When you're replacing a cylinder or a gasket or doing a top end on your bike, many times it's very, very difficult to get to the nuts that are on the base. And you want to be sure that you torque those evenly whenever you change a top end. Motion Pro has come up with this great tool. It's the torque adapter, okay? You can put any size wrench in there and you can tighten it up. On the back is a 3/8 drive. You can put your torque wrench in there, get the wrench on the nut that's on the base of your cylinder, and make sure everything is torqued evenly. This is a great tool. I have one in the shop. We use it all the time. It comes with instructions as well. Go see your local dealer or get to motionpro.com. And don't forget, go over to Vintage Motocross Q&A to get a 20% discount on all Motion Pro tools. Okay, I want to thank some of our sponsors and some of the people that help out with the show. Mike Chamberlain, thank you for your support. This is a little bit different than a sponsorship package. It's a one-time fee, and we will gladly put your name up on the board. Behind us here, Mike Chamberlain, thank you so much. My buddy Scott Burnworth has an event coming up October 1st, a Carlsbad reunion that is at Booze Brothers in Vista, California. George Ackerman and the Moto Barn, October 28th. That is in Ruther Glen, Virginia. Get a hold of George if you want to go to that event. I will be there along with Martina Faltova-Cope, Gary Bailey, Steve Wise, Warren Reed, and Barry Higgins is going to be there. And I think there's a few more surprise guests as well. That about wraps it up for this edition of Vintage Motocross Q&A. And once again, I want to thank Scott Summer for being my guest tonight. And thank you, the viewers at home. Next week, my guest will be Billy Lyles, Billy the Bullet Lyles, next Wednesday on Vintage Motocross Q&A. Until then, be well. We'll see you next time.